Mr. Witcher is joining us. Hey guys, it's me again. I'm glad you're here. I hope that everyone's keeping safe and well. I actually have only one book for you today, but this one packs a lot. This is Great Tales of Horror by Edgar Allan Poe, and this has 10 short stories in this, and I will talk about each story one by one. I have here this 1972 Bantam Pathfinder edition. Look at that cover. So I got this from Shopee a couple of months ago from this very nice little bookshop by Kay Costaniano. So I have her link in my description. I've been dipping in and out of this while I'm reading George Eliot's Middlemarch. And as I've mentioned, this has 10 short stories, all very dark and grim, a signature of Poe. So let's start with the first story I read from here. Let me show you the contents section first. So this is the content section, and you can see there all the 10 stories. I picked first the Black Cat. I decided to start first with the Black Cat because I love cats, and most especially the black ones. And so I thought, oh, so cute. Poe made a story about a cat. But Edgar Allan Poe was like, really? You thought it would be cute? Are you lost, baby girl? 2 pages in, and I was already very disgusted, and I almost cried because of what was happening in the story. It was very upsetting, and I was very traumatized. If you don't like to read about extreme animal cruelty, I suggest that you avoid this story and find another Poe story instead. But if you were able to get through the documentary Dunn with cats, I think you'll be able to go through this. The Black Cat was first published in 1843 and is basically a study of the psychology of guilt. This is usually paired with The Telltale Heart by those who are doing analysis on the subject. It's actually considered as one of Poe's darkest tales, and so that definitely says a lot about how traumatized I was by that story. On screen is an early 20th century illustration of the story by Byam Shaw. And here's another one done by Aubrey Bridsley. Next, let's have The Telltale Heart. So The Telltale Heart came out a few months earlier than The Black Cat in the same year, 1843. I haven't read it yet, but I know that the story is narrated by the murderer who committed the crime, much like in The Black Cat. This is one of Poe's best-known stories, and I'm putting up on screen an illustration for this story done by Harry Clark in 1919. The third story, that's The Cask of Amontillado. So the Cask of Amontillado is actually my very first Poe story, and I read it back in college. This dark tale of revenge was first published in 1846, and just like The Black Cat and The Telltale Heart, it is told from the perspective of the murderer. Interesting fact, Poe actually wrote this story as a response to Thomas Dunn English, a fellow writer whom he had a bitter feud with. Before the Cask of Amontillado was written, English published a revenge-themed novel called 1844, where he had a character named Marmaduke Hammerhead, a famous author who wrote The Black Crow, obviously modeled after Poe, and who was described in that novel a drunkard and a liar. So who wouldn't be annoyed by that? So of course, our Uncle Poe was very angry. He wrote The Cask of Amontillado as a response to that novel, where he modeled the character who was walled up alive in that story after you know who. On screen are some illustrations of the story, one by Harry Clarke in 1919, and then another one by Arthur Rackham in 1935. The Pit and the Pendulum. So this story was first published in 1842. That's ahead of all the stories we've covered so far. And in this story, our narrator is a prisoner set during the Spanish Inquisition, although some elements in the story are not historically accurate. In this story, our narrator describes his experience of being tortured. So, this particular tale is actually considered as somewhat unique compared to the other works of Poe, because this tale doesn't have the usual supernatural elements in a Poe story. It is more realistic, and the terror of the tale comes from the vivid sensations that were described by a tortured prisoner. On screen is an illustration for the story done by Harry Clarke in 1919. Next is The Mask of the Red Death, which I read right after doing this research because I got very intrigued. So this was first published in 1842, the same year as The Pit and the Pendulum. And this particular story is directly tagged as a Gothic fiction, which is quite different from some of Poe's stories where they are just tagged as horror fiction. As I have mentioned a while ago, I have already read this story and is now my favorite Poe tale. It reads like a nightmarish fairy tale. So in this story, we follow a prince's attempts to avoid a plague called the Red Death. By doing so, the prince and an entourage of his friends, staff, and entertainers all went to this faraway castle, locked themselves in there, detached from the rest of the world, and tried to forget about the plague by having parties and all kinds of festivities in there. It definitely was kind of reminiscent of Salò, which was written by the Marquis De Sade, but I tried to research about it if this story was inspired by that novel, but I found out that this story was actually written before Salò was even published. The story was described so vividly, and my favorite part was how the castle was described. There were, in the story, 7 main rooms in the castle, each decorated with a different color. And each of these rooms has its 2 Gothic windows, tall and narrow, and these windows correspond with the room's color. For example, the first room was blue, and vividly blue were its stained windows. The second room was purple, the third room was green, the fourth room was orange, the fifth was white, the sixth room was violet, and the 7th room was black. However, its windows were described as having the color of deep blood red. So cool, right? It is said that it is often analyzed as an allegory of the inevitability of death. However, there's a group of critics who doesn't recommend that allegory. This story, it is said, is directly influenced by the first ever known Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto, and this influence is clearly mirrored by the castle setting in this story. I haven't read The Castle of Otranto yet because I'm a big pleasure delayer, but this definitely added to my excitement for the book. On screen are some of the very interesting illustrations for the story. One by Harry Clark in 1919. Here's another one by Arthur Rackham in 1935. Another one by Aubrey Beardsley in 1894 to 1895. Another one that I love. This is a painting with the same name as the story by the Mexican surrealist painter Enrique Chavarria. Next, we have The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar. This was published in 1845 and actually caused a stir because people and even doctors during that time thought that it was a factual account and even a medical essay. It was only pronounced as a hoax after Poe admitted that it was pure fiction. The narrator in this story performs mesmerism, or what we now call as hypnotism, to a dying man, an attempt to delay death. And in this story, he narrates what followed after. On screen is an illustration for this story done by Harry Clark in 1919. Next, we have Hop Frog, or the Eight-Chained Ourang-Outangs. So, another revenge tale written by Poe. This story was published in March 1849, just a few months before Poe's death at 40 years old. So, unlike the other revenge tales we have already talked about, where the narration was done by the murderer, this one is told through a third-person point of view. The story is about a crippled dwarf called Hop Frog who exacts revenge on a tyrannical king and 7 of his ministers after that king pushes and humiliates his friend who was also a fellow captive. According to several analysis done for this tale, this particular story is actually Poe's literary revenge for his critics, particularly on one Elizabeth Ellet, a fellow writer and poet, and her circle, who were spreading rumors about Poe. So, with this interpretation, the first lines of the story actually becomes more colorful. Let me read it quick. I never knew anyone so keenly alive to a joke as the king was. He seemed to live only for joking. To tell a good story of the joke kind, and to tell it well, was the surest road to his favor. Thus, it happened that his 7 ministers were all noted for their accomplishments as jokers.
The shade of it all.
On screen are some illustrations for the story done by Arthur Rackham in 1935. Next, we have The Fall of the House of Usher. So, another story of Poe that is directly tagged as Gothic fiction. This was first published in 1839 and has themes of madness, isolation, and family in it. I haven't read the story yet as I don't want to finish them all so soon, but I know that this is one of the most popular Edgar Allan Poe stories, and that this is also one of the most critically examined stories by him. On screen is an 1894 illustration of the story done by Aubrey Beardsley, and here's another one by Harry Clark in 1919. Another one I haven't read yet, A Descent into the Maelstrom. This came out in 1841 and is actually a story within a story. This is about how our narrator survived a shipwreck and a giant whirlpool. This is considered as an early form of science fiction and is said to have been inspired by the Moskasterman, a system of whirlpools found in Norway, and is considered as the largest and strongest whirlpools in the world. On screen is an illustration of the story done by Harry Clark in 1919. For our last tale, we have The Murders in the Rue Morgue. This came out in 1841, the same year as The Descent into the Maelstrom. And this is actually considered as the first modern detective story. The story is about a man named Auguste Dupin and his trusted friend, who is our narrator, and how they were able to solve the mystery of the brutal murder of two women. So Poe's Dupin, who is actually considered as the very first fictional detective, became the blueprint for the other fictional detectives who came after him, such as Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot. Fun fact, Poe actually has the original title of Murders in the Rue Trianon, but came up with a final title so that it would have a better association with death. I am not putting up some illustrations for the story because the illustrations I found were very spoilery. Well, there you go. Those were the stories in this very nice little book of Edgar Allan Poe's Dark Tales. Let me know which is your favorite Poe story and which among those stories you found interesting. I would love to hear your thoughts. Again, thank you so much for being here with me, and I do hope to have you again next time. For now, please take care and see you soon.